Please welcome the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. John McDonnell.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm really grateful. It's nice to be back in Manchester. In the late 1960s, when I first left school, I was touring around the country looking for work. I spent 6 months in Manchester on Moss Side. I've still got the cough, to be honest. I want to cover 3 things. First, where the economy is today and the problems we face. Second, the huge challenge facing all those on the left attempting to address these problems. And then third, how our movement can start to develop a convincing strategy to deal with this challenge. I want to try and give you a sense of some sense of direction of the new leadership of the Labour Party in respect to cooperation. My view is we need a wide-ranging debate on the way forward, but central to that is the understanding that cooperatives, shared ownership and workplace democracy will all have a central role to play in the development of our economic strategy. Jeremy Corbyn laid out some key ideas last weekend in his speech to the late Fabian Conference. At the heart of his argument is the case of fairness. We currently live in an economy that is visibly failing on this score of fairness. Cooperatives, we believe, play an essential part of the economy of the future in creating that fairer economy of the future. But we live in an economy, as we said, that's held back by the past. Wealth is more concentrated now than it has been for a century or more. Social mobility has dwindled. The financial regulation legislation, which was put in place after the crisis, is currently being unwound, and serious attempts at scrutiny scrapped just a few years after that catastrophic crash that was caused by the bankers. Yes, we've lived with a succession of governments who promised the opposite. They believed that by unleashing the markets, governments could unleash opportunity and creativity. We know this approach promised new freedoms for individuals, free from the dead hand of the state. The Tories promised a shareholding democracy which would arrive through privatisation, a trickle-down effect which would mean that even if the rich got very rich indeed, everyone else would be a little better off. And even those in the Labour Party seem to be comfortable with the super rich. But the promises of freedom and popular capitalism turned out to be illusory, as we said then. Today, share ownership by individuals is at close to the lowest level ever recorded in our history. Just 12% of shares are owned by individuals in the UK, down from 28% in 1982, and pension funds own only 3%. So shareholding democracy never happened. What we saw instead was an immense concentration of wealth in the hands of the very few. As has been said, 62 people own the same wealth as half the world's population. But the same process was arguably more sweeping in Britain than many other places. On the economist Thomas Piketty's figures, we moved in this period from one of the most equal economies in the Western world to one of the most unequal. As a share of the GDP, the state wasn't shrunk, but was transformed. On one hand, government became more centralised, local authorities, for example, were stripped of their powers. On the other side, the state became more passive, just moving money from one place to another. So the share of public spending on social security has risen as that for investment has fallen. And when our banks crashed, the state was there in effect to arrange an immense transfer of wealth to them, backed with promises of even more. We bailed out the banking system and stabilised the economy at a vast expense. And unfortunately, as we say, caught up in the crisis was the Co-op Bank, an institution, to be frank, behaving too little like a co-op or too much like a commercial bank. We are left in a world in which the fundamental promises of the free market approach have not been delivered. Instead of a trickle-down effect, we have a monstrous trickle-up. Instead of a more dynamic economy, productivity is slumped. George Osborne, since becoming Chancellor, squandered his chance to resolve any of these structural problems. But let's just go through some of those structural problems. In terms of sectoral imbalance, our economy remains unbalanced. While services have recovered, manufacturing has actually shrunk since 2008 and is now back in recession. In terms of regional imbalances, employment in London has risen by 12%, employment in the rest of the whole country is just 0.3%. In terms of global trade, we say our imbalance with the rest of the world, the current account deficit at the moment has reached record levels in the last 12 months. In terms of debt, After years of collectively repaying their debts, households now have begun to borrow again. Unsecured lending, the riskiest kind, and credit cards and payday loans, is rising rapidly. The TUC research reports that the number of people with problem debt has risen by 700,000 in the last 2 years to 3.2 million. This is what austerity economics have left us with. And if it continues, the next Labour government will have to repair the damage. We can't turn the clock back though. Let me just say, we need to be quite clear about this. Whatever the achievements of the past, we simply can't turn the clock back. Whether it's 1997 or 64 or 1945. We must defend, and we are defending, past achievements. The victory on tax credits was one part of that. We now have to fight a generation in defence of our NHS and so much else. So a priority for the next Labour government will be in sustaining the good that's been achieved in the past. That isn't enough, to be frank. The changes that have been wrought in our society over that period of time are now so great that they impose a need for a profound shift in how we think about how we change the world. And the reasons are well known. First, what some still think of as a traditional working class has been shrunk. Manufacturing today accounts for just 10% of all employment. Only 14% of private sector workers are union. The working class today is still the clear majority of the population, but it's far more fragmented. The ability to win a political majority by appealing to major sectional interests has waned as a result. Let me say this, the forward march of Labour hasn't halted, it's just changed uniform. Second, let's be clear, there is immense cynicism about our major institutions. Big business, banks, the media, none are trusted, and corrupt politicians. I think we've come just above a state agent. So whilst opinion polls report clear majority support for basic, long-standing demands, and I use the example of nationalising the railways, which is popular in all opinion polls, there's still a deep cynicism about our capacity in government to actually deliver. So put these two factors together, we've depended for too long on a strategy that looked only to the state as a vehicle for change. The argument that came to dominate the left, at least in the 1930s, was a simple one. First, you take control of the state, then you use the state to change society. This simple proposition achieved, yes, an extraordinary amount. We live today with the legacy of what the Labour movement and its party has achieved. Some of the most enduring and popular institutions, the NHS, outstanding amongst them, they were all the product of this way of thinking, of capturing the state. Capitalism, it was argued during the long boom after the Second World War, had been successfully tamed. It was no longer the brutal struggle depicted by its early critics. Government intervention in the welfare state, yes, smoothed its rough edges. Private property and production were no longer sacrosanct, and giant corporations effectively planned and managed large chunks of the economy. And the government's main task then was to redistribute the wealth generated from that growing economy. And yes, rising inequality was predicted to follow. Deeper questions, the questions we're asking today around ownership, control and democracy, in many instances were left to one side. So Labour governments, old and new, thought and worked backwards. So the post-war boom showed rapid economic growth and falling inequality under old Labour governments. New Labour, meanwhile, oversaw a decade of rapid growth and restrained the growth of inequality. Both approaches involved a compromise with the reality of capitalism of their day. Their success, however, meant deeper questions about the economy were left unasked by the mainstream of Labour. And that, in turn, left Labour governments unprepared for the systemic crisis that occurred. The first crisis in the 1970s brought about the collapse of the global economic order that had sustained rapid growth for the previous 30 years. The second, at the end of the 2000s, brought about the collapse of the financial system that had sustained rapid growth for a decade. And we're still living with the consequences of that second collapse. We may yet find ourselves confronted by what the Bank of England Chief Economist Andrew Haldane has called the third wave of the global crisis that might be appearing before our eyes today. If New Labour made a mistake that Old Labour did not, it was to cede too much to the existing powers. The compromise meant the Labour government had to rely upon a fundamentally unsustainable model of of a debt-ridden growth in our economy. The discussion today is how we change the rules of the game. Left unchanged, we can see this direction of travel. Rising inequality, as Piketty and others have suggested, increased environmental destruction, the erosion of our basic civil liberties in our workplaces and outside them. So our challenge today is that we must learn to think systemically about the kind of economy we want. That's why the discussion today at this conference is so significant. Where our opponents now warn and threaten about the terrors ahead, we must present a positive case for the future and all that we want. Charity Nesta published a fascinating piece of research recently showing how future-focused the different political party manifestos were in the last general election. The Tories in their manifesto talked relentlessly, overwhelmingly about the future. Labour didn't. And was even in the words, the semantics of the manifesto themselves. We cannot allow that to happen again. We cannot be conservatives with a small c. But the future we want to be built on the best of what we do now. We want to learn from the past, and as the anti-fascist writer Carlo Levi put it, the future has an ancient heart. So if the old economic strategies have run their course, we must look elsewhere. There's a long labour movement tradition of decentralisation and grassroots organisation, but it has been somewhat hidden by the success of the statist approach. This radical tradition has deep roots in our collective history, from R.H. Tawney, G.B.H. Gold, Robin Owen and Guild Socialists back to the Rochdale Pioneers, the Society of Weavers in Fenwick, Ayrshire, and even further back to the radicals of the English Civil War. With the stress on self-organisation and on-the-ground solutions to problems, this tradition stressed the need to organise, not just to win the state. Even in the successes of the state, however, we can see this tradition at work. Take the NHS, the crowning achievement of Labour's greatest government. It was modelled on and inspired by the Medical Benefit Fund in Tredegar, an Iron Bevan's hometown. This was a fund set up by a local initiative to provide medical treatment to the local community. It was a hugely successful scheme. Bevan said, when he asked about his plans as health minister, that what he was doing was extending to the entire population of Britain the benefits we had in Tredegar for a generation or more. We're going to Tredegar College. There's a thread within the Labour and radical movement of self-organisation running right back even before the changes. Those early organisers of democracy against the old corruption. We have to draw here on the tradition and an argument within the Labour movement that stress work from the bottom up and provide a natural fit for both the changed society we inhabit and the changes now we can see coming. Technology is proving disruptive. It can have terrible downsides, de-skilling and accelerated concentration of wealth. But it can also open up new possibilities, the explosion of sharing what that the internet can provide. There's an entrepreneurial spirit at work here, not just the theatrical means and one-upmanship of Gordon Gekko, but a desire to create something better for all of us. The expansions of co-operatives in Britain since the crisis, matching developments across the rest of the world, shows the potential. There are now more than 7,000 independent co-operatives throughout the UK. They contribute 35 billion to the economy. Co-operative businesses are more stable, whilst 1 in 3 new businesses makes it through the first difficult 5 years, 4 out of 5 co-ops. An effective economic strategy for the left would now look to build upon this. It means thinking beyond using the state to redistribute incomes. It means thinking about how we ensure assets are distributed more fairly. It is a battle for those assets. We can already see where this is happening. I just want to point to some examples of local councils. At the moment, local councils, as you know, they're pushed to their limits by spending cuts, and they've been forced to respond in deteriorating economic conditions. But let's look at some examples. Oldham Council has looked to develop its resources to the crisis, its responses to the crisis, working with the Oldham Credit Union. They reduce the burden of debt locally. Its fair employment charter rewards local employers and looks to use local authority procurement to improve working conditions. Enfield Council in London has developed innovative contracting models with major local employers to support good jobs. And Preston, there's some Preston councils here, see, inspired by the example of Cleveland, Ohio, has developed an extensive programme of work. Preston was one of the councils facing the sharpest cuts to its funding out of any in the country, but they're responding creatively. They've got major local employers and buying so-called anchor institutions like the University of Central Lancashire to drive through a local programme of economic transformation. By changing their procurement policies, these anchor institutions were able to drive up spending locally. They're looking to shift the proportion of the Joint Council's £5.5 billion pension fund to focus on local businesses, keeping the money circulating within festivals. And the Council is actively seeking opportunities to create local cooperatives as part of a local business succession, working with the local Chamber of Commerce. The aim is to sustain high-quality local employment by giving the chance of working to keep the business in local hands. To be frank, it's inspiring to see what Labour Council is doing to respond to this. But it's not enough, to be frank, to oppose austerity. We must also provide a vision for the future. In dire and in dire circumstances, some of what Labour local councils are doing is precisely that. For it's action at scale that can make a difference. What the central government does still matters, even if it cannot and should not do everything. A future Labour government will end the current programme of spending cuts. We will protect what's already been won, but we must look beyond this point. We will be seizing the opportunity to create a fairer and more democratic society. Osborne wants to make the government smaller, blindly hacking away at essential budget defences. We think government should be smarter. That means recognising the limits of central government, but recognising also where it can help. It's not about flipping Osborne on his head and simply increasing government spending, but we know there are some things government can do better. Vital infrastructure spending is fallen under this government. Labour will invest and will invest across the whole country. The fair economy requires a fairer tax system. The great majority of people pay their taxes because they know taxes sustain the services we all need. It's part of what makes a good, functioning, fair society. Yet we have large corporations and the super rich apparently viewing their tax payments as voluntary, optional extras. To be frank, that can't go on. Ultimately, it undermines the public services we all need and forces the burden of taxation onto people less able to carry it. We can't pretend state spending is the answer to everything, but there are clear limits on what can be achieved here. But we can make the system work better and distribute the burden more fairly. My colleague Susan Mount, also Chief Secretary, she's now looking at the current system of so-called tax expenditures or tax reliefs, the different get-outs from the reliefs provided by the tax system. There's a thicket of different schemes that are thrown out, costing the taxpayer now £110 billion a year. Some of this may well be justified, but some of it will not be. We'll look at whether we need to simplify the system so it's fairer to everyone and encourage the growth of a fair and prosperous economy. We create a fair tax system, taxing assets in an economically efficient way, and will help create the conditions for a flourishing co-operative entrepreneurship. We'd work with our partners in the cooperative party to help bring this about. The biggest hurdle we face in establishing co-ops at the moment is initial funding. Small businesses in general, and not just cooperatives, face dreadful difficulties in getting the funding they need from our high street banks. No other major developed economy has just 5 banks providing 80% of the loans. We look to break up these monopolies, introducing real competition and choice. Regional and local banks, prudently run with a public service mandate, have to be part of the solution. With consortium cooperatives providing an effective means for new businesses to share and reduce costs, we'd look to support these at a local level, working with local authorities, businesses and trade unions. Many of you know that Italy's Macora law, providing match funding for those seeking to establish co-ops, is a model that is worth considering, and we will. We'll look into the recommendations in Graham Nuttall's report on employee ownership, creating a statutory right to request employee ownership and have proposals considered by their employers. We should look to extend this approach, offering employees first rights on buying out a company or plant that's been dissolved or sold or floated on the stock exchange. The Tories have offered a right to buy. Labour, under the Jerry Corbyn leadership, that seeks to better this, would be creating a new right to own. We'll discuss these cooperative ideas as Labour's new economics lecture series, which we've just launched, and which is being expanded right the way throughout the country, where our economic advisors are touring the country, giving lectures, holding seminars, listening to comments and commentaries from the individual towns and regions, and building our economic partners as a result. As the policy development process rolls out in the next few years, we'll ask ourselves time and time again how the practical, everyday socialist principles of the cooperative movement will be applied. In an uncertain world where a laissez-faire market approach continues to fail. Cooperation, in our view, is an idea that whose time has come again. This is the start of developing a new, positive economic alternative for labour. It's the new economics. In my speeches these days, I'm under a restriction not to tell any jokes, not to wave any small books, but to tell you straight what we're about. And that's what that speech was all about. It was actually telling you now that we're reconstructing the economic, ideological base of the labour. And that this is a critical opportunity for everyone over this next 6 to 12 months to participate in one of the most exciting adventures in the socialist practice in this country for nearly a century. And the reason I'm here today is yes, to set out, maybe in a relatively boring speech, some of the ideas that we're putting forward, but to invite you to participate in that venture. I think there's a potential now that we can install in every activity of government the cooperative principles. And what we're saying to all those members of the Shadow Cabinet out there now, and all the members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, that the cooperative principles need to be applied in every policy area. It will be like a checklist. If you're developing new policy, have you looked at cooperative principles in relation to that policy? How are you going to implement them practically? Who have you involved in the cooperative movement in the development of those policies? So that we have one of the most inclusive, engaging development of our ideas that we've seen in generations. And I just say to you this, don't miss this opportunity. Don't miss this opportunity. Because I think not only will this give us the basis in which we can transform our economy on the principles of fairness and socialism that we've put forward, but I actually also think it could be the basis on which we gain electoral support and electoral popularity. So I'm here to say participate. There's an open door. You don't need to